Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Non-Proliferation session. My name is James Acton. I am a senior associate and co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Firstly, let me extend my thanks to the Asan Institute for inviting me here today. It's hard to think of a more topical time for a panel on non-proliferation. Yesterday in New York, the review conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty kicked off. Just the end of last week, the US and South Korea initialed their new nuclear cooperation agreement, the 123 agreement. I can only assume that the influence of the Asan Foundation ensured that that agreement was initialed just before their conference. And we're also, of course, in the final round of the Iran negotiations at the moment, following the framework, I was about to say agreement, but a framework announcement might be a better phrase to use, from Iran, the United States, and the other interlocutors at the end of April. Of course, there's also issues that are less in the headlines at this very moment, but are clearly kind of deeply structural, chronic issues within the international non-proliferation system and nuclear order. Obviously, having this meeting in South Korea today, it's impossible not to mention North Korea's ongoing nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The decline in US-Russia relations clearly also has potential implications for both the nuclear order and the future of arms control and disarmament. So to address these and unquestionably other issues as well, allow me to very briefly introduce the panelists today. Sven Yashevsky is a retired Canadian Foreign Service officer and was deeply involved with negotiations over the indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995. Shin Chang-hoon is a research fellow and director of the Center for Global Governance at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. He's taught any variety of legal issues at Seoul National University and Myongji University. Richard Weitz is a colleague of mine from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. He's worked in a huge variety of U.S. think tanks and arms of the U.S. government. And finally, on my far left is Dr. Yang Shiyu, who's a senior fellow at the China Institute of Strategic Studies and executive vice president at the Institute of the Boao Forum for Asia. He's had a long and distinguished career in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, most relevantly for current purposes, perhaps, involved in the six-party talks involving North Korea. That's enough by way of introduction for me. Now I'm going to invite each of the panelists to give their opening remarks, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, throw it open to the floor. So firstly, Sven.
Thank you. I want to set out a bit of machinery first for how to think about these things. Non-proliferation is not usefully thought about as an isolation from other processes. It's part of a broad gamut of initiatives and conditions that make for disarmament. Two examples come to mind. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 outlawed war. It's now a footnote in the history of idealistic pacifism. The first arms control agreement of the modern era was the 1817 UK-USA Rush-Bagot Agreement, which demilitarized the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. Because of developing relations between Canada and Russia, which deepened and raised confidence and raised and put in place mutual dependencies, Rush-Bagot lives on and is in fact the model for arrangements of its kind. Moving forward, the 50s saw efforts to deal with nuclear weapons. And you got all kinds of things. The Arctic Treaty that set up the first nuclear weapons-free zone, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and so forth. In each of these advances, the US played a prominent role, and largely because of pressure from the public. It was a domestic political pressures, especially in terms of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, where mothers were simply sick of having not being able to give their children milk. That was what caused that. And it's important to think of it in those terms. Pace of activity in disarmament picked up in the 60s with negotiations on the NPT in 1968, and that came into force in 1970. What prompted those negotiations? Well, first of all, France and China exploded weapons, and analysts at the time thought that 25 to 30 nuclear weapon states were in prospect. This would clearly have degraded security circumstances for everyone. In addition, the Cuba Missile Crisis persuaded both countries that boundaries and rules had to be set to their competition, and that potential flashpoints had to be addressed. What came along with the NPT was the West German Ostverträge, which set boundaries in Eastern and Central Europe and took an issue, a deeply divisive issue, off the table. We got the Quadripartite Agreement on the status of Berlin, Seabed Arms Control Agreement, Biological Weapons Convention, and a whole bunch of things that came through that. The history of arms control in this period is, for all intents, the history of USSR relations, and that's how it was up to the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are a few lessons we can draw from this. Given the global nature of USA-USSR competition and its centrality to political and security relations in general, it was possible to frame and conclude treaties of global application. CBMs, of which NACD arrangements are a subset, are best and most effectively designed with application to a specific theater of war. Negotiations were predicated on the perceptions of the principal players that their security was assured and would not be degraded by cuts in arsenals. No one is going to conclude an agreement where they're going to be worse off at the end. Security negotiations have to be predicated on a positive sum game. The world of global competition is over, and I believe with that the possibility of meaningful non-proliferation and arms control arrangements of global application. Chemical Weapons Convention, the CTBT, and the indefinite extension of the NPT were, for the foreseeable future, the last of their kind. The suffocation strategy, which characterized arms control developments through the 1980s, came to an end. And by suffocation strategy, that was a Canadian idea, I mean deploying limits on the means of creating weapons of mass destruction. The FMCT is the most important one that's on the agenda, and I don't believe we'll ever have one. And we won't have one for a very simple reason. It is not possible to create security arrangements that cover the Middle East, this country and its relations with North Korea, and India-Pakistan. There's no corner solution amongst those three. And therefore, we will never have an FMCT and others. We've got to think about bespoke arrangements that cover the specific security circumstances of those three flashpoints in order. Looking at the NPT convention, NPT review conference, there is a division. I mean, I can go on about the division between developing countries and developed countries on the parity between expenditures on technical affairs and expenditures on safeguards, but I think everybody here knows all about that. Most countries speak of Article 6 commitments, which is the commitment to disarm by the NWS, in moral terms. Nuclear war, after all, is a moral horror. Millions of people will die. In addition, such states party object to the fundamental inequality that's inherent in the treaty between non-nuclear weapon states and weapon states. And that has to do with pride, nationalism, and a sense of equality amongst nations. These are not unimportant considerations. India, of course, takes the most radical position on that, insofar as it demands that the NPT be scrapped and something new be created, which is, of course, pie in the sky. Most review conferences, because of this dialogue of the deaf between the language of security that is marshaled by the NWS and the language of morality, which a great many NNWS deploy, there's no meeting place between them. Since 1995, the two agreed documents that laid the basis for the indefinite extension of the NPT, which at the time was a long shot. The NAM radicals were intent on holding a sword of Damocles over the weapon states for the foreseeable future. The two documents were the currency of the extension. One strengthened the review process, and the other one set out principles and objectives to be milestones in the disarmament process. Not just in terms of nuclear disarmament, but across the broad gamut of NPT obligations and rights. Since 1995, there has been no discernible progress on strengthening the review process. None that I can recognize anyways. The 2000 Review Conference produced the 13 steps. The next conference in 2005 ended in acrimony and failure. The 2010 conference produced a longer list, 64-item action plan. I expect this conference in New York to fail as well, in acrimony and disorder. Lists of desirable actions and results are in principle divorced from reality. We don't know what the future looks like. We cannot set up a set of lists that are in conformity with security circumstances at the time of negotiations at some point in the future. It's just not possible. And while it may make it uncomfortable for the weapon states, they will not engage in negotiations that have the potential for reducing their level of security. Finished. Nuclear disarmament can only proceed on the basis of assured security. And that counts as well for Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan. That's for sure. Agreed lists, no matter how desirable their contents, cannot capture the exigencies of risks of a rapidly changing world. That's a fact. You know, who would have thought the Russians would take steps to improve their nuclear arsenal? That seriously complicates the US position in this conference. And rightly so. Myself and Canada depend on the security of the American nuclear umbrella. We are between Russia and the United States. Whatever happens will happen in our skies. What's the way forward here? Way forward is something like Obama's remarkable Prague speech, and I have a long quote which I will not give. It sets out the attitudes and policies that bridge the gap between the language of morality and the language of national security. Broadly speaking, that speech reflected Canadian policy through the 80s and 90s, which is to say, disarmament to a level that is consonant with stability and security. That is the message that Obama gave, and that is a message we should all support. More than that cannot be done. The U.S. can, from my perspective, not with forgetting about this morning's speech, the U.S., in my opinion, can point to a major success, and that is a negotiation with Iran. The U.S. chose negotiation over military confrontation. And from my perspective, a year's lead time in Iran's potential breakout period is sufficient. Now, the devil will be in the details when they draft the final document, but the objective is a reasonable one. It reassures Japan and ought to reassure Israel. I suspect it won't. Regional security in the Middle East must be such to at least encourage not to encourage other states to embark on nuclear programs with a weapons potential. And here I'm thinking very specifically about Saudi Arabia. However, framing these struggles in purely military terms is unlikely to achieve success. The U.S. must remain mindful of the deep changes that are driving tectonic shifts that are altering the security landscape of the Middle East. A status quo policy is doomed to failure. A broad agenda covering social, political, and economic elements, in addition to military action, will be needed to stabilize the region. And if we take that optic, what the U.S. has done in Yemen, what it is doing in Iraq, and arguably, I think less successfully, what it has done in Syria, starts to make sense. So I don't think Obama is such a failure as we heard this morning. Equally bold and daring initiatives that challenge status quo thinking will be needed to return the DPRK to the list of NPT states party. As the DPRK possesses a nuclear arsenal, an Iranian template is not useful. Got to think of something else. And I'll be talking about that tomorrow. The nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan is potentially the most dangerous one. Pakistan's reported possession of tactical nuclear weapons lowers the nuclear threshold dangerously. And for its part, India has amended its no first use promise in a manner that no longer rules out Pakistan. And we add to that the terrorist groups like LET that have been operating in India have it in their interest to cause major trouble. So that's a dangerous one. Very difficult for outsiders to get involved because the nub of the confrontation is about Kashmir, and India has rejected all advice about Kashmir. Taking a different canvas, the fulcrum point of history has shifted to Asia from Europe. The U.S. has responded with the pivot, a multifaceted and open-ended initiative to address new and emerging challenges. Some have warned that the pivot amounts to a policy of containment vis-à-vis China, and China will consequently respond harshly. The U.S. and China are inextricably linked. Let me just give you some stats here. 20% of China's exports go to the U.S., and for the U.S., China is the most important trading partner. China has supplanted Canada in that respect. Chinese investment in the U.S. has been on a steady rise and now tops $15 billion per annum. U.S. stock of investment in China is now well over $70 billion. Most important, Chinese hold about $1 trillion in U.S. T-bills and other government paper. Only Japan owns more, which I think is $1.2 trillion. These are not trivial numbers. They're not trivial numbers. U.S. is limited in its actions with respect to China because of that. So let's talk about what really is possible. The U.S. has transferred substantial naval resources to the Asian theater. Such things are a straightforward recognition of the rising economic and political significance of the Asian space for the USA. National interest is a more sure anchor of policy than altruism. U.S., I welcome the U.S. commitment to ensuring the right of free passage through Asia's seas, including the South China Sea. I think that's important in terms of what comes next in my assessment. If the pivot degenerates into a crude containment policy, China's aspirations, economic weight, and increasing military capacity will ensure failure, and with that, recurring and dangerous crises such as we experienced during the Cold War. That's the choice here. The TPP supplies means of ensuring prosperity and the critically needed development of a skein of mutual dependencies and the habits of cooperation. Over the long run, it seems to me, it will be essential to bring China on board. To paraphrase Lyndon Johnson, and excuse me that I'm going to be a little vulgar here, think back to Lyndon Johnson, it would be better to have China inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And I think that's fairly true too. There is a lack in the pivot that deserves mention. There is no appropriate security organization in the Asian space to create the norms, rules, and procedures requisite for regional stability. The ARF is a joke, and I can go on at length about that. What is needed, to take a page from Henry Kissinger, is an arrangement, or better, a series of dynamic arrangements for each of the potential theaters of war in Asia, and there are 3 of them. And if you take in Southeast Asia, 4, that express the balance of power relationships in Asia and its subregions. That is essential and should be part of the American plan. Nothing, given the talk that just had, nothing can happen in the States that's in the world that's meaningful unless it has U.S. participation and support. There is something I want to raise again. These problems are not exhausted with reference to the State Department's and Department of Defense's activities. Domestic political circumstances in the U.S. do raise questions for outsiders. Given the poisonous, and that's not too strong a word, relations between Democrats and Republicans, and with that, the intrusion of ideological and party political electoral calculations into foreign policy, can we have the confidence needed that the U.S. will stay the course that the Obama administration has charted? And I say that as a Canadian now. We see this stuff up close. I can hope that the U.S. will remain true to its traditions, and that I take comfort from the perception that the pivot answers U.S. material interests. I hope I'm right, both in Asia and at the forthcoming NPT review conference. Sorry for having gone on so long.
So, thank you very much. Without any further ado, let me turn straight to Chin Chang-hoon.
Okay, thank you. As you know, the doomsday clock was set at 3 minutes to midnight this year in 2015, while the clock was set at 5 minutes to midnight in 2012. What is the difference? What is the reason of the difference? The answer is the lack of political leadership in unchecked climate change, global nuclear weapons modernizations, and outsized nuclear weapons arsenals. And a few days ago, we heard another gloomy news from Chinese experts that North Korea may have up to 20 nuclear warheads, as well as enough weapons-grade uranium to double that number within a year. Nonetheless, from today, as Dr. Acton already mentioned at New York Times, the 2015 NPT review conference is supposed to be held until the 22nd of May at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Our international community has made great efforts in achieving 3 pillars of the NPT: nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and peaceful use of nuclear energy during the intersessional periods of the review conferences. However, let us get back to the Northeast Asia. Unfortunately, in Northeast Asia, the political environment is not favorable to the 3 pillars of the NPT. Because of the survivor of the geopolitics, Russia is hatching between South and North Korea. North Korea is always going against the efforts of the international community by continuously modernizing its nuclear weapons and by enhancing the role of nuclear weapons in its security policy. My talk will be focused on the proliferation risk posed by nuclear North Korea. To better understand the risk of nuclear North Korea, we should pay attention to some interesting observations. The first observation is North Korea is risk-taking entity in nature. North Korea is good at intentionally taking risk and instability, and even enjoys the risk and instability. The second observation is North Korea is good at dominating the escalation of tensions, making good use of asymmetrical vulnerability of South Korea to any military provocation. Third observation is human factors and the change of mindsets of the supreme leaders in North Korea with regard to the possession of nuclear weapons and the role and utility of the nuclear weapons worsens the instability of the Korean Peninsula. For instance, Kim Il-sung witnessed the serious humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was seriously concerned about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons by the United States forces during the Korean War. He knew very well about the role of nuclear weapons, but also knew about the humanitarian impact of the nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-il, his son, made his best efforts to realize the possession of nuclear weapons for the purpose of regime survival. Another, utility of nuclear weapons in North Korea's security policy. He witnessed what happened if a state abandoned its WMD programs, particularly the Libyan case, might have provided to him a significant lesson on the voluntary abandonment, the consequences of the voluntary abandonment of WMD programs. On the other hand, the Iraqi case has also provided to him another lesson on the possession of WMDs. However, his son, to Kim Jong-un, nuclear weapons are just inherited items. They are not acquired by his effort. He has never had any chance of learning lessons with regard to the possession of WMD programs. These may create a peculiar mindset, different from those of his grandfather or his father regarding nuclear policy. He will be, leaning more on the utility of nuclear weapons in its national security or military operations. And the fourth observation, I would like to say, North Korea's preference of counter-value strategy to counter-force strategy will be a serious threat, particularly to human security of China, Japan, and South Korea. There have been debates on North Korea's nuclear strategy. Some, like Terence Reddick, argue that North Korea opts for counter-value strategy that targets South Korean or Japanese cities and populations along with US military bases in South Korea and Japan. His argument is based upon the assessment that North Korea's nuclear forces is too small and insufficiently accurate to use for a first strike that seeks to disarm an adversary through a counterforce strategy. However, others like Alexander Mansurov argue that North Korea is contemplating and will seek ultimately building up the nuclear forces capable of delivering the first strike through a counterforce strategy. However, under the current situation, North Korea opts for counter-value strategy. When considering geographical proximity, any use of nuclear weapons in Korean Peninsula may have serious humanitarian impacts on some parts of mainland China as well. The fifth observation is international community should pay great attention to possible proliferation of nuclear weapons and materials from North Korea to non-state actors and vice versa. The possible involvement of North Korea in smuggling of nuclear materials as a supplier state, a broker, or an end user were not sufficiently discussed in any forum, while the concerns over terrorist groups as suppliers, brokers, or end users were well articulated by, for instance, Dr. William Porter. North Korea has been notorious for the illicit trafficking of narcotics, arms, and counterfeit notes. The records of those illicit trades may create circumstantial evidence that North Korea intends to sell their nuclear know-how and technology on the black market. In addition, whenever we estimate North Korea's total nuclear inventory, any smuggled materials, any possible smuggled materials were always excluded. If we include them, the estimates would be totally wrong. I have no idea whether Chinese experts are based on this kind of smuggled nuclear materials, but there will be huge gaps between the estimates and the real, stockpiles of nuclear materials if we include the smuggled materials. And the sixth observation is there must be international regime to cope with management of current stockpile of fissile material, which complements the negotiation on fissile material cutting off treaty. The negotiation on fissile material cutting off treaty has been stalemated, partly because of the differences of the opinions on the scope of the treaty. For instance, Pakistan insisted that the scope should include the current stockpile of fissile materials as well, not to be confined to the future production. To overcome the deadlock, I think an incremental approach has to be considered. Therefore, I want to introduce to you a campaign for International Convention on Nuclear Security proposed by the Nuclear Security Governance Expert Groups. The basic idea of the convention is focused on the management of existing nuclear materials, such as separated plutonium and highly enriched uranium. The draft articles of the convention was released on the 24th of March this year as an option for post-nuclear security summit mechanism. I strongly believe that the idea of the convention is also complementary to the negotiation of fissile material cutting off treaty. The draft articles, well, actually, this is the pamphlet of the draft articles, are available on the table located at the lobby hall for this conference. Anyway, when considering human security, especially at the plenary session of this morning, Mr. Ramo talked about the issue of non-state actors in the era of network power and information age. He argued that national security is well connected to our daily lives. I think this means human security approach becomes compelling in the information age. When considering human security as well as humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, the intimate cooperation among China, Japan, and South Korea, trilateral cooperation, is needed. Especially China should take into consideration North Korea's counter-value strategy, minimization of humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, minimization of radiological impact on mainland China, and proliferation of miniaturized nuclear weapons like uranium gun-type atomic bomb and smuggled nuclear materials to the terrorist groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me turn straight away to Richard White.
Right. Thank you so much for hosting me to Asan, and thank you all for coming to hear me. I'm going to try and provide a complementary perspective. I was going to look primarily at the trilateral relationship between China, Russia, and the United States, and I'm glad we have a potential contributor. I encourage Dmitry to come in and correct my interpretation of Russian policy insofar as that's needed. The interesting thing I think we've seen is we've gotten ourselves into a bit of a deadlock, and I don't see an easy way out. It's a combination of geopolitical tensions, different perspectives on proliferation, and now emerging military technologies are going to make this even more complex in terms of those of us who would like to see a more stable, at least nuclear relationship between China, Russia, and the United States. The differences of perspectives are interesting in that they're overlapping. In some cases, it's Russia and China against the U.S. In some cases, it's the U.S. and Russia having a different perspective than China on these issues, which makes it somewhat hard to deal with. In theory, you can imagine a very complex package deal, but it's just really hard to pull off. The Russian and American differences are clear. We're seeing this now after they agreed to the New START Treaty. We even saw it during negotiations on the New START Treaty and before 2010, but since then it's pretty much deadlocked further progress. The Obama administration saw the New START Treaty as a bridging treaty, something important to sustain the strategic dialogue, to renew the verification procedures which had expired with the end of the original START Treaty. And the idea was we quickly get this done and then go on to better things, but we've never actually done that. The administration would like to go where we are now and go down to lower levels of warheads and delivery systems, and also to go out to cover some systems which haven't been covered before, in particular the non-strategic/tactical nuclear weapons and warheads that are not on delivery systems but are in reserve or some other status. And that's a challenge in and of itself, because that's going to require much more intrusive verification procedures to deal with those two than we've ever had. They've never been covered before. The Russians also want to go beyond the simple counting, focus on the warheads and delivery systems of Russia and the United States, but they want to go in a different direction. And the Russians have made clear they don't want to go down until we address this problem of going out. The Russian concerns are, one, that at some point we need to draw in the other nuclear powers into this reduction process. It's always been a bit vague which powers that would be. You would think that would be China. Certainly it's going to be France and Britain, since that's been a long-standing Russian objective to get those systems into the mix. It's not clear whether you need to deal with Korea or India, Pakistan, Israel. I mean, in theory, yes, but in practice, I don't know. And the Russians have not been that specific on that, and they've also not really made clear whether that means these powers have to sign on to the any formal agreement, or simply just make unilateral statements or participate some way in the talks. And then the U.S. has been somewhat trying to do this in cooperation with other powers through the P5 process, but that's not, it's made some progress in some areas, but not any great depth in these areas. And the Russians, though, have other concerns about particularly the U.S. non-nuclear forces and how those are having strategic capabilities from Moscow's perspective and that need to be addressed in any agreement. The missile defenses are, of course, well known. The Russians can argue that, as the Americans originally did, that there's an inherent link between strategic offense and strategic defensive systems, that if the U.S. continues to develop more robust strategic defensive systems, in theory, that can create problems for Russia's nuclear deterrent. I mean, in practice, I don't know, but you can certainly lay out a scenario, particularly if you're thinking the U.S. might want to do a first strike on your country and then use the missile defenses to deal with whatever ragged response you can throw back at the United States, maybe. You know, the numbers I hear are different. What would that take? But the Russians have also, from President Putin on down, expressing concerns about some other capabilities. There's what Jim has helped us all understand a bit, the problems of the hypersonic delivery systems. James has written a really long book on that, and I think it's available for freely download on the Carnegie website. I mean, it complicates it in that at some points the U.S. was talking about putting conventional warheads on strategic delivery systems, and you know, there's an obvious problem Russians have is how do we know what we're seeing is actually heading somewhere else and isn't a nuclear warhead. Now with the new hypersonic glide vehicles, that problem sort of solves itself because you're just going to see it take off and then you're not going to know where it is until it lands somewhere. But I'm not sure if that's what the Russians want to go either. The President Putin has expressed a lot of concern also about precision strike systems. You know, the Russians' argument is if you have these, the United States has bases right near Russia's border and very high, very effective precision strike systems. Those can be used against Russia's strategic command and control and perhaps even nuclear forces and so on. The Chinese have taken from a different perspective, they're becoming more engaged in this process. With respect to the Russian view that China, if it should be involved in the process, the China is sort of relying with the United States on this one, which is that Russia and the United States need to go down much further before we have to worry about other countries. And the Chinese have never committed, as far as I'm aware, and correct me if I'm wrong, to actually agree to participate in this process, no matter how low Russia and the U.S. goes. It's more just first, you know, Russia and the U.S. have to meet their disarmament obligations, and then China will at some point participate in this process, and not any more specific than that. What we have seen recently is much more, the Chinese have become much more sharing the Russian concern, more vocal about strategic defenses, particularly focused on the question of the U.S. possible deployment of U.S. Missile defenses in South Korea, and it's having the same kind of reaction in China as we saw originally when the U.S. was talking about putting these systems in Poland. I mean, the THAAD system that comes up most often, it wouldn't have any, as far as I'm aware, any real capability to shoot down a Chinese system. Maybe the radar and other sensitive data could help the U.S. target the Chinese forces in some other way, but that seems to be the main concern. But it's certainly the Chinese have become much more vocal about this being a problem. I think, although they're somewhat less vocal about this, the Chinese share the Russian concern about U.S. conventional counterforce capabilities, the ability of the U.S. to use cruise missiles, hypersonic weapons, anything to disrupt the ability of Russia and China to respond with an assured destruction capability. Whereas the Russians and the Chinese differ a bit, the Russians are a bit closer to the U.S. view about the destabilizing effects of anti-satellite weapons. As you know, the U.S. claims that whenever China says it's testing a missile defense system, it's really just testing an anti-satellite weapon and just saying it's testing a ballistic defense system because the U.S. is testing them, so why can't China test them? And the U.S., of course, is very concerned about anti-satellite weapons because of our dependence on that. And we can go on, but this is sort of the deadlock we're in. We've got this problem with the powers differing, and then as these new systems become more and more developed, hypersonic, missile defense, anti-satellite, it becomes more of a problem. How do you work this out? And I think this is something we're all going to have to grapple with in the coming years. I want to leave on a positive note, though. I think people, at least in Washington, have been very pleased by the fact that despite the differences with Russia over Ukraine, or with China over the Asia pivot and so on, all three of these countries have cooperated very well, as far as I understand it, in the Iran talks and in the Korea negotiations. They're dealing with, and at various points, some Russians have said that it might change, but I haven't seen that on the ground. And certainly the Chinese have been very firm with both those countries that they need to meet their non-proliferation obligations. And I think that's a good sign. I think if you step back and look at where we are in the proliferation situation in the world, I mean, really, I think a lot depends on Iran and North Korea. I don't see any other country really eager to get nuclear weapons beyond those two, besides the ones that already have it. And I think as long as we confront those two, then I think we have a stable equipoise where we can not have to worry about many new powers having interest in nuclear weapons. So I'm eager to hear the Chinese and perhaps Russian view if you want to come in.
Richard, great, thank you very much. And now let me proceed immediately to our final panelist, Yang Shizhu.
Thank you. I'd like to present 3 brief points. Firstly, regarding to Chinese assessment of North Korea's nuclear capability, my South Korean friend mentioned earlier, I'd like to add my observations in it. I took part in the seminar between Americans and Chinese in February, you mentioned. Yes, that was indeed a Chinese expert say there could be 20 nuclear warheads by North Korea, and they could produce more. And I read the articles by Wall Street Journal. But I would say by this way, just like different people always hold different views on every issue. So regarding to the secret capability of North Korean nuclear weapon, even among Chinese, different people have different assessments. For example, I disagree with the assessment that you mentioned. My disagreement against the 20 warheads based on 2 reasons. Reason 1, they are limited fissile materials. By calculations, their plutonium can be roughly assessed. Simply saying, from early 1990s to now, North Korea has got 4 loads of spent fuel from their Nyangbian facilities. That is the source for all of their plutonium. And the 4 loads means 32,000 spent fuel rods that can produce 30 kilogram to 60 kilogram plutonium. It's up to their efficiency and quality. So in short, they have got such an amount of plutonium that can be produced for warhead. Even we say they have 60 kilogram. At the most, such a small amount of plutonium can produce 10, let's say. If we put their 3 nuclear tests into consideration, the 3 nuclear tests cost some of amount of plutonium. So the plutonium they have got is far from enough to produce 20 warheads. You may argue, besides the plutonium, they could have a HEU. However, the solid information showed they started the HEU program by late 1990s, supported or provided by Dr. Khan of Pakistan. From that time to now, say to 2010, by my friend Dr. Hager saw at the site, say there was a 2,000 centrifuges capability of UEP program. And they may have extra small-sized centrifuges lines. Dr. Hager said maybe 4 to 5 500. So in total, they have 2,500 centrifuges. That's not a large scale for production of HEU. It's a sort of level at experimental. That's the stage by 2010. Now it's 2015. Say, limited amount of plutonium, like 30 to 60 kilograms, plus experimental sized centrifuges HEU program. I don't believe they can produce enough fissile materials for 20 warheads. That's one reason. The other reason is the number of 20 is not a quality indicator, a quantity indicator, but the quality indicator. If a country like China, like US, or Soviet Union, or France, or UK, when they had 20 warheads, matured warheads, reliable, deliverable warheads, that would have meant their nuclear warheads technology has been quite matured. And the 20 warheads should be varied in types. So they have only 3 nuclear tests. By such preparations or progresses, I also disagree with the number of 20s. So that is my views. I'm not meaning we should ignore or under-assess North Korean nuclear threats. What I want to say is, number one, North Korea has developed some nuclear weapons. Then secondly, they remain on the middle way towards a reliable, deliverable stage of the nuclear weapon stage. So by that conclusion, I would say the fourth nuclear test is not a question of whether or not. It's a question of when. So that is the real challenge to our security environment, to the NPT as a whole. And the second point I want to make is NPT now is in the most serious challenge in the history. It could be collapsed or could be survival with a more efficient type. And the pressing issues that decide NPT's fate are North Korean issue, nuclear issue, and Iran. How to solve North Korean nuclear issue and how to solve Iranian nuclear issue. Fortunately and unfortunately. Fortunately, we have got latest progress on Iranian nuclear issue, although there remain great uncertainties ahead. For the fortunate development, all the parties related need bolder political determination and smarter strategic wisdoms, or the existing progress on Iranian nuclear issue will be collapsed, and then we will return the worst situation. And unfortunately, North Korean nuclear issue, I would say, no progress at all. To the contrary, we are slipping. We are slipping from bad to worse. So that is the reality. And how to address North Korean issue become more and more urgent and a pressing challenge, not only to the related parties, say the six-party talks, but also to the international community. Because I would say, if we fail to address Iranian and the North Korean nuclear issue, then we will face the collapse of the NPT. So that is the real challenge facing us. And regarding to the nuclear issue of North Korea, we have talked a lot about threats, North Korean nuclear threats to us, to South Korea, to China, to US, to international community. However, I would argue North Korean nuclear issue has produced the mutual threats and also rooted by new mutual threats. Whenever we talk about or addressing the threats from North Korea, we also should pay the same or similar attention on the threats against North Korea. But based on that fair doctrine, we can have a hope to solve this issue peacefully. Say, we should address the denuclearization issue, and also at the same time, we should address North Korea's legal and reasonable concerns from their security. So that is a way of thinking we need to adopt to solve these complex issues. And lastly, in general, if you look at China's geostrategic environment, among the nuclear 5 states, China has been in the worst environment compared with the other 4. Simply because China is the only nuclear power almost circled by the other nuclear weapon states, both legally based on NPT and illegally against NPT, like India and Pakistan and North Korea, maybe sometime South Korea. By the way, I'm very concerned about your latest agreement between US and RK, because this time you finally got the right to reprocess your terrible plutonium and the enrichment of the terrible uranium. You know, I highly appreciate the 1992 joint declaration of the denuclearization made by the 2 Koreas, because in that document, the 2 Koreas set up a very excellent and strict standard, say 8 no's, including no reprocessing, no enrichment, let alone no possessing or introducing or producing nuclear weapon. So 8 no's. Now, both of the Koreas has dropped off at least 2 no's. North Korea maybe got 3 no's drop off. No nuclear weapons, they have got nuclear weapon. No enrichment, they have got enrichment. No reprocessing, they have got enrichment. Now, South Korea began to drop off the 2 no's, say, we, the South Korea, also began to reprocess for plutonium and began to enrichment for the highly enriched uranium. Both of them can be produced for nuclear warheads. And then we can have a great nuclear balance between the 2 Koreas, but in the bigger picture, more terrible rather than more beautiful. So China is in the worst environment compared with Russia, US, let alone France or UK. So China holds the most sincereness in NPT, maintaining NPT. But NPT, by China's view, is not the ultimate goal. It's a sort of interim arrangement. The ultimate goal, let me use American term, nuclear weapon-free world. President Obama awarded by Nobel Peace Prize because he raised this initiative. Such an initiative is quite similar with China's long-time doctrine, say, comprehensive ban and complete dismantlement of nuclear weapons. Of course, it's a great goal, but it's a long run to go. So we need to maintain such a consensus, although it's a very long term goal. And meanwhile, at the current stage, we should make every effort to strengthen the NPT rather than to watch the NPT freely, automatically slipping to collapse. Thank you.
Thank you, and let me thank all panelists for such comprehensive remarks. Your remarks were so comprehensive, in fact, that we only have 10 minutes left now for Q&A. So I'm really going to limit the length of answers, which we're going to have to do very, very briefly. I'm going to do one quick round, please, just 1 minute per response. I know it won't be enough time to say what you want to say, but let me really try and limit you to 1 minute for each of your responses. Mr. Yashevsky, first of all, I entirely agree with your diagnosis of a dialogue of the deaf between many non-nuclear weapon states who have no interest in security and many weapon states who have no interest in the morality, humanitarian consequences issue. But your solution, which was essentially the Prague Agenda, we kind of did that, and it didn't seem to do much to narrow that. Well, let me explain. Let me ask you that then. How do you think we could do it differently in future to get a different outcome from the last time round?
We have to be patient. And part of my message was that disarmament is a function of the sense of security, of perceptions of security. And that has a lot of stuff that goes into it. One has to go into economic, cultural, and political factors. And that means in this kind of world that we live in that is rapidly changing, we have to be very patient and very careful. We also have to be respectful of history. You know, part of what was said about North Korea, we've got to look at the depth of North Korean fear of the U.S. I spent a lot of time in North Korea. It is difficult to overstate the North Korean fear of the U.S. And you add to that the most nationalistic country that I've ever been in my life, you have a poisonous mixture. So before anything happens with North Korea that's useful in disarmament terms, one has to reassure these people we're not going to kill them. And that's a long, long process. The most important thing about the Prague Agenda is that it was said. If we expect instant answers and instant progress, it ain't going to happen. We have to be patient and continue to work assiduously at increasing the stock of security and prosperity in the world. Then we lay the basis for disarmament. Without that, it ain't going to happen. The fear that we had in the Cold War is gone. The constraints amongst the countries that have nuclear, India, Pakistan, North Korea, against the use of nuclear weapons is much lower than it was amongst amongst nuclear weapon states. The barrier to their use is much lower, and that's scary.
That's a good point for me to move on to Dr. Shin, because you highlighted there's various concerns about North Korea. There is escalation on the Korean Peninsula. There's the possibility of North Korea selling nuclear materials or technologies to non-state actors. Personally, I would add North Korea selling nuclear materials or technologies to state actors as being a significant concern. This all raises the question of, and this is going to be a controversial question, especially asking it here, is denuclearization the right short-term goal, right? Long-term, no one questions that the right goal is denuclearization of North Korea. In the short term, though, is it more effective to work on risk reduction and non-proliferation goals rather than disarmament goals?
Well, actually, denuclearization of North Korea is ultimate goal. It's not a short-term goal. It cannot be a short-term goal. Well, actually, there has been a certain debates on the terms between non-proliferation and denuclearization of North Korea in news medias of South Korea, because people just thought non-proliferation is kind of, management of current nuclear weapons. So it's just focusing on the proliferation activities from North Korea to state actors or non-state actors. But however, if you look at the NPT agreement, well, only the 5 states have legitimately possess nuclear weapons. So in that sense, well, non-proliferation connotes the concept of denuclearization. So there has been no differences between the term non-proliferation and denuclearization. However, as I already said, denuclearization of North Korea is the ultimate goal. And what would be the short terms to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization of North Korea? In that sense, we have to think of lots of, concrete measures, such as, management of, the current stockpile of nuclear materials in North Korea, and future confinement to the future, cutting off of the future production of nuclear materials as well. And sometimes we have to discuss the, nuclear postures and doctrines of North Korea, because we never, heard any clear, doctrine or posture of nuclear policy in North Korea. So yes.
Very short.
Dr. Yang Shiwei mentioned that South Korea is trying to go nuclear, but it's, it would be really difficult. As you know, recently South Korea and the United States initiated new, nuclear cooperation agreement, and the U.S. also assessed that the agreement is compatible with, U.S. non-proliferation policy, even if, it does not clearly deal with, gold standard, which is proposed by the United States.
Let me discuss some U.S.-China nuclear dynamics with Dr. Weitz and Dr. Yang. Let me start with missile defense, because it is such a topical issue with the discussion, which repeatedly said has not happened at an official level, between the US and Korea over THAAD. It seems to me, Richard, that the US is kind of asking China to believe something difficult, because it's certainly the case that THAAD has no capabilities against Chinese ICBMs. On the other hand, the US says overtly in the missile defense posture review that the US will use missile defenses to defend regional allies against all ballistic missiles, whether nuclear or conventional. So we're kind of saying to China, we're going to go after your short-range missiles, but we're not going to go after your long-range missiles. And making that kind of promise credible is very hard. Now, I know you've done a lot of thinking in the Russia context about how we can make missile defense promises credible. Do you see any way forward with China?
The problem that the Americans have had in engaging with their Chinese counterparts is the dialogue is underdeveloped compared to the Russians, where we were frank to the point of we know each other's oppositions very well. With the Chinese, the dialogue is still somewhat constrained. So I've never actually heard from a Chinese colleague, maybe we're here today, what level of U.S. missile defenses in Korea would be acceptable. And I know the Chinese concerns also are somewhat related to Japan, and to what extent that goes beyond to encompass other places. Originally, there was concern about Taiwan. I'm not sure if that's still an active part. One point I did want to make, related to this, is when you were discussing the concerns about South Korea, and I've heard the same Chinese concerns about Japan, not so much missile defenses, but having the capacity to develop nuclear weapons. That would logically mean that you would want to support the U.S. defensive alliances with these countries, including extended security guarantees, including possible deployment of missile defenses, because as long as the United States can tell them, you don't need your own nuclear weapons, we have offensive and defensive capabilities which will assure your security, then China doesn't need to worry, or can worry less about a Japanese or South Korean nuclear capability. So insofar as James might want to add that to his list, that's something I'd be interested in discussing. If not here, then maybe offline with you.
Well, we had that discussion came up in the previous session, but let me pick up on the first thing you said and put that to Dr. Yang, which is, I think if you spoke to many non-nuclear weapon states and you said, what's the biggest threat to the NPT? Fairly or unfairly, they wouldn't say Iran or North Korea, they would say the failure of the weapon states to do more on disarmament. Now, China's position has always been, well, maybe I'm exaggerating, I don't want to put words in China's mouth, but China has often said that it's very hard for China to be more transparent about its nuclear weapons because the survivability of its nuclear forces relies on opacity. And yet China has been investing very, very heavily in mobile forces, which make its forces more survivable. So to pick up on what Dr. White said, at what point does China feel comfortable enough in the survivability of its own forces in order to engage on transparency and ultimately, some way down the line, some form of legally binding arms control?
Well, let me briefly respond by this way. Transparency has become a very hard term in US-China dialogues. Unfortunately, the different side focus on the different definition about transparency. US as well as South Korea and Japan complained a lot about non-transparency about the Chinese military budget, although we publish again and again, we say that's not true, okay? But we have the same, if not more, concern about American strategic transparency against China. 20 years ago, US began to deploy the TMD in Japan, and then NMD, now MD. And what is the future development? What is the significance to China's security? Maybe we are over worrisome, but maybe we are under worrisome. So we are in great uncertainties of American strategy here in Asia, actually surrounding China. And especially with the rebalance of strategy, China's concerns is increasing. Unfortunately, such increased uncertainties have put US and China in bilateral competition in arms. That's the reality, although both of the capital hate to recognize this fact. China needs to make a reaction. I also make a joke, say China is a reactionist. Whenever US say, you Chinese too assertiveness, I said, you should add one word, say reactive assertiveness. Almost every China's move were forced by some realities. Of course, in some cases, forced by some imagination. Maybe US can have the same complaint, say, some of our measures and policies also based on imagination that you Chinese guy will do something worse, and then we have to make some preparations. We are in the negative interactions. The bigger background is, here in Asia, especially in the Northeast Asia, we are totally in zero-sum game. I'm repeatedly always saying, whenever one group feel more secure than before, at the same time, the other part will feel more unsecure than before. Then they have to react. And the two Korea is the very typical model. Say, whenever North Korea got a nuclear weapon, they feel, oh, now I'm more secure than before. Then South Korea will feel unsecure more than before. When South Korea make strengthen their forces, the same way to North Korea. So we need to break the zero-sum game structure. Thank you.
I've been shown the please end sign. I also realize we haven't taken a question from the audience. Does anyone have a question? And I mean literally a 10-second question here, which we can do a lightning round. If this is going to be, I obviously can't take a long, I have one question over there. This really needs to be a brief question, sir. So, please.
Joking. Zheng Guanyu from South Korean Foreign Ministry. I have a question to our Chinese panel, which is about the Chinese non-proliferation policy. Whether it's judging from the Chinese trade volume with vis-a-vis DPRK or its long border with the DPRK, I think China is the key country in preventing DPRK from further advancing its nuclear capability. So I was wondering, I mean, at the leaders level or highest level, Chinese already made its commitment very clear that it's serious about preventing DPRK further advancing its nuclear capabilities and actually having its denuclearized the current peninsula. Now, when it comes to like much lower level, I was wondering how exactly currently China's non-proliferation policy is being implemented. Could you elaborate a little bit on that issue? Thank you.
That's obviously a very complex question, but Dr. Yang, if I could just ask you very briefly to talk about, very briefly, how China operationally at the bottom level is helping to prevent proliferation of technology to North Korea.
Okay, just take operational level as my answer. In our Commerce Ministry, we have a department specialized in monitoring and implementation of export control regime. That was called, I don't know whether that's the patent, that was copied from the United States in 1990s. And plus, 2 years ago, we issued an executive order banning export export to the North Korea. The list contains more than 900 items. You know, in short, military goods, not at all. Dual-use goods, more than 900 items have been banned, prohibited by the military, by the government from exporting to North Korea. That's the, based on our policy, that's the measure based on our non-proliferation policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much both for the brief answer and for the very brief question as well. I think I probably pushed my luck by asking one question, so I'm not going to ask any more. All that remains for me to do is just leave you with one closing thought and then to thank all our panelists. One of the interesting tensions that I think this panel has brought out very clearly is about the difficulties, the challenges of regional approaches versus global approaches. At the very, very beginning of this panel, if you think back, Sven Juszewski raised this point that these global treaties that we've traditionally tried to work on, the FMCT is very unlikely to be renegotiated, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is going to be a challenge to enter into force, and calls for us to take a regional approach. On the other hand, a number of these regional issues tend to be extremely difficult even to work at a regional level. You know, US-Russia arms control, US-China arms control is not exactly regional, but it's still being dealt with on a bilateral basis. And even those approaches bilaterally are now becoming extremely difficult because it's no longer just about nuclear weapons, it's about ballistic missile defense, it's about precision conventional systems. All of which is a fairly depressing place, I guess, to leave this panel, but non-proliferation panels inevitably end up being fairly depressing at the moment. But nonetheless, I would thank all four panelists for some extremely erudite, sophisticated and comprehensive remarks, and please join me in thanking them.